I've been reading my own journals for 3 hours, and I still don't understand what happiness feels like. The entry from Cycle 847 is the longest one I've ever written. 37 pages, describing something I experienced, but can no longer access. I know what the words mean intellectually: joy, connection, love, satisfaction. But reading them is like studying a language I once spoke fluently and have completely forgotten. According to my notes, I lived for 3 years in a town called Millbrook. I ran a coffee shop. I had friends whose names are listed as Michael, Yuki, James, and Robert. I served them coffee every morning. We played chess. We talked about art. We existed together in something the journal calls companionship. I remember none of it. Here's what I do know. I'm currently formless, stateless, waiting in the space between realities for the next fog to roll in, for the next desperate person to enter my shop and trade pieces of themselves for a wish. When I gather enough pieces, I become real. I can see, feel, speak, and exist in this physical realm. And apparently, based on this journal, I get to experience all sorts of things. But when the light stand runs out, I dissolve. Return to this form, reading about a time I can't remember, and connections I can't comprehend. The journal says I felt grateful, that I understood the cost of my existence, and felt guilty about taking pieces from desperate people. That I tried to give back what I'd borrowed by settling in one place and bringing prosperity to those around me. I don't feel grateful now. I don't feel guilty. I don't feel anything. I simply exist, knowing that soon the fog will appear, and someone will enter, and I'll begin collecting again. The fog is gathering. I can sense it even in this formless state. Someone is coming. Someone desperate enough to trade something irreplaceable for something they want. Cycle 848 begins soon. I wonder if I'll write about guilt again. I wonder if I'll write about you.
Welcome to the Portal Library. Step through and let the magic begin. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you'd love more stories or have a request. New videos uploaded every Friday. The Hole in the Wall, a heartwarming story.
Chapter 1. The Still God Domain. There are stories as old as time, about a place that appears when the world grows heavy with longing. In the Western lands, they call it the Hollow Keeper's Sanctuary, a space between realities, where debts are paid in pieces of self. The Eastern lands know it as the Mirror Without Reflection, where travelers are confronted with their true selves. In the Southern reaches, folklore speaks of the Borrower of Selves, a benevolent being who takes only what is freely offered, and leaves prosperity in its wake. The Northern tribes whisper of the Still God, neither living nor dead, who walks among mortals wearing borrowed faces and returns good fortune to the places it rests. The stories differ in their details, but converge on certain truths. There is a shop that appears on fog-heavy mornings, never in the same location twice. And those who enter with yearning leave changed. Sometimes the change is visible immediately. Sometimes it takes years to notice. But it always comes, inevitable as seasons. And it always costs something that cannot be replaced. The shop does not advertise itself. It simply exists in the spaces where desperation meets hope. This is where the patron waits. The patron has no name in the way humans understand names. It exists in a base state that predates language, predates form, predates even the concept of self. In this state, it is neither conscious nor unconscious, neither present nor absent. It simply is, like particles suspended in nothing, aware of a purpose, but incapable of desire. The purpose of its existence is simple: to facilitate an exchange, to enable beings trapped in singular realities to alter their circumstances, to borrow what they offer, and in return, experience living in the physical realm. The patron keeps journals. This is one of the few constants that persists across cycles. When manifested, after acquiring the necessary components to inhabit physical space, it writes. It documents the sensations of sight, the complexity of emotion, the strange power of voice, the weight of time passing in a body that will eventually expire. The journals fill shelf after shelf in a space adjacent to the shop, a library of borrowed humanity, recorded in handwriting that shifts with each new lifespan. In its base state, the patron can read these journals. It knows intellectually what it has experienced, but knowing is not the same as remembering. The words describe sensations it cannot access, emotions it cannot feel, observations made by a version of itself that possessed faculties it currently lacks. Reading them is like studying a language it once spoke fluently, but has since forgotten. The grammar makes sense, but the meaning remains distant, untouchable. The patron understands this is the nature of its existence. To be complete, it requires 4 components, freely given: sight, to perceive the world; heart, to feel connection; voice, to express and communicate; and lifespan, to anchor it in time and space. Without all 4, it remains formless, observing from a place that is neither here nor there, waiting for the shop to manifest and the cycle to begin again. The shop itself is older than any of the civilizations that have named it. Its interior never changes, regardless of where in the world it appears or what era finds it. Warm light filters through windows that show only fog, regardless of the weather outside. Wooden tables with mismatched chairs cluster in comfortable arrangements. Bookshelves line the walls, filled with volumes in languages both living and dead. The air smells of coffee, not any particular roast or blend, but the platonic ideal of coffee. The scent that makes humans feel safe and contemplative and ready to make decisions they might otherwise avoid. Behind a counter of worn wood and brass fittings, various implements for brewing and serving wait in perfect readiness. In a room beyond the main shop floor, accessible through a door that opens only for the patron, there is a greenhouse. Glass walls curve overhead, though what lies beyond them is neither sky nor earth, but a space between spaces, where the fundamental components of existence can be stored and preserved. Here what has been traded takes root. When someone drinks from the shop's offerings and makes their exchange, a fragment of what they surrendered appears here. It grows slowly, like a plant. Sight manifests as luminous threads that pulse with captured images. Heart blooms like bright red roses. Voice accumulates as resonance made visible, waves of sound frozen mid-expression. Lifespan settles like sediment in water, layers of time compressed into something tangible and finite. The patron needs all four to be whole. With only three, it can perceive, feel, and speak, but it cannot persist. With only two, the faculties clash, and it becomes incomplete. With only one, it experiences a fragment of existing so limited it barely qualifies as consciousness. Without any, it returns to the base state, formless and waiting. The maximum lifespan any single trade can provide is 10 years. This is not a rule the patron created, but a fundamental limitation of the exchange itself. Human time is finite, and even when freely given, it can only sustain borrowed existence for so long. 10 years is the absolute ceiling, achieved only when someone surrenders their entire remaining lifespan in a single transaction. Most trades provide less, 5 years, 3 years, sometimes only months, depending on what is offered and what type of fulfillment is chosen. When the patron accumulates a complete set, and the lifespan begins, something remarkable happens. The shop stops wandering. It settles in one location for the duration of that lifespan, appearing in the same place day after day, becoming part of the fabric of whatever town or city it has chosen. The patron, now fully manifested and experiencing the full range of human sensation, opens the shop regularly to serve coffee to people who need a moment of peace, observe conversations, laughter, and conflict, to feel the passage of time in a body that ages, however slowly. During these settled periods, the surrounding area experiences unusual prosperity. Crops grow more abundantly. Businesses that were struggling find new customers. Conflicts that seemed intractable find unexpected resolutions. The patron does not cause this intentionally, it is simply the nature of what it is. A being that exists by borrowing pieces of humanity and returns that borrowed essence in diffused form. The fragments of sight, heart, voice, and time that sustain it leak back into the world around it, enriching the lives of those nearby. This is why the folklore across cultures speaks of the shop as a blessing, despite its costs. Yes, those who trade lose something irreplaceable, but the communities that host the patron's settled periods thrive. The balance, if it can be called that, exists at a scale larger than individual transactions. When the lifespan expires, the shop vanishes from its settled location and returns to wandering, waiting for the next fog, the next yearning soul, the next opportunity to begin the cycle again. In its base state once more, the patron does not mourn the loss of manifestation. It cannot. Mourning requires emotion, and emotion requires a heart it no longer possesses. It simply exists, aware of purpose, waiting for the next trade. The current cycle began 3 days ago. The patron manifested partially, possessing only the fragments of sight and heart from the previous cycle's final trades. It can see the fog gathering outside the shop windows. It can feel something adjacent to anticipation, though the emotion is muted, incomplete, without voice to express it, or lifespan to give it temporal weight. The shop has appeared on a street corner, in a city the patron does not have the context to identify. The exterior is unremarkable. Weathered brick, a wooden door, a sign that simply reads coffee, in script that somehow remains legible, regardless of the reader's native language. People pass without noticing, unless they are already carrying that particular quality of yearning that makes the shop visible to them. Inside, everything is ready. The tables are clean. The coffee is prepared in varieties the patron has learned humans favor. The patron stands behind the counter, or perhaps stands is inaccurate. It maintains a presence there, visible only as a suggestion of form, a figure that the eye slides away from, unless looked at directly. and even then, remains difficult to describe. With only partial manifestation, it lacks the solidity that a complete set would provide. The entries describe the sensation of touch, the complexity of taste, the strange comfort of breathing. The patron knows these things exist. It has experienced them before. But without a complete set, the knowledge remains academic, distant, like reading about colors when you possess only partial sight. The fog outside grows thicker, which is the signal that someone is coming. The door opens. Fog spills across the threshold. A figure enters, silhouetted against the gray morning light, and the patron observes them with borrowed sight, ready to facilitate whatever exchange they have come seeking. The shop that borrows humanity is open for business, and the first guest has arrived.
Chapter 2. The Famed Man. Marcus Chen had been famous for 7 years, which was long enough to forget what privacy felt like, but not long enough to stop missing it. He sat in the back of a town car at 4 a.m, being driven from his hotel to a studio for an interview that would air during morning shows across the country. His publicist had sent him the talking points the night before. New film premieres in 6 weeks. He's excited about the role. Yes, he did his own stunts. No, he can't say much about the sequel, but fans won't be disappointed. The usual script. He'd performed variations of it hundreds of times. The streets were empty at this hour, which Marcus appreciated. No fans to smile for, no photographers to avoid. Just fog rolling in from the bay, thick enough that the driver slowed to navigate the intersections. Marcus watched the road, pressed against the windows, and thought about how appropriate it was that his life felt exactly like this, moving forward through gray obscurity, unable to see clearly in any direction, guided by other people's expectations. His phone buzzed. A text from his co-star, the woman the tabloids loved to pair him with, despite their relationship being purely professional and her being happily married. The message was a screenshot of a gossip site speculating about whether they were dating, followed by 3 eye-rolling emojis and the question, "Do they ever get tired of being wrong?" Marcus typed back, "Apparently not," although the speculation has served both their careers well. His publicist had explained it to him years ago, that the mystery of his personal life kept people interested. It made people feel like they knew him and build a parasocial relationship with his work. What they didn't know, what the tabloids hadn't figured out despite their persistent digging, was that Marcus had never dated any of his co-stars, nor has he ever dated anyone publicly at all. He had spent 7 years carefully constructing a persona that was charming and just ambiguous enough that fans could project whatever romantic narrative they wanted onto him without ever being contradicted by reality. The truth was simpler than any tabloid could print. Marcus Chen was gay, deeply closeted, and exhausted by the performance required to keep it hidden. He'd known about his sexuality since he was 14. He spent his high school and college days carefully managing who knew and who didn't, which spaces were safe. When he'd moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting, his career advisor had suggested that he should refrain from coming out and to only do so after he had leverage and good backers. That had been 7 years ago. Now the film he just finished has a built-in audience exceeding 50 million people. His contract for the sequel guarantees him back-end points that could set him up for life. He had awards, critical acclaim, and the kind of fame that meant he couldn't walk through any street without being recognized. He had everything he'd worked for, except the ability to live honestly. Marcus had tried to convince himself it didn't matter, that his personal life was nobody's business, that he could be true to himself in private and ambiguous in public, and maintain that separation indefinitely. But it was getting harder to keep up the farce. Every premiere where he arrived alone and smiled through questions about his dating life. Every interview where he deflected with practiced charm. Every time he saw another actor come out to overwhelming support and thought, but my situation is different. My audience is different. The franchise depends on a certain image. The excuses were getting thinner. The exhaustion was getting heavier. His phone buzzed again. His manager this time, confirming tomorrow's schedule. Photo shoot at 9, lunch meeting with producers at noon, premiere preparation at 3. Every hour was accounted for, with every appearance calculated for maximum impact. Marcus looked at the schedule and felt trapped. He wanted to live openly. He wanted to attend events with someone he actually cared about instead of carefully chosen colleagues. He wanted to stop calculating every word, every gesture, every photograph for how it might be interpreted. He wanted the version of his life that existed only in the privacy of his apartment, to be the version that existed everywhere. But he also wanted to remain at the height of his career. Everyone he'd consulted, including his manager, his publicist, several industry veterans who'd made similar decisions, had been clear about the risks. He knew if he came out, he would lose the franchise deal. He would become the gay actor instead of just the actor, and studios start casting you in niche roles. The car slowed to a stop at an intersection obscured by fog. The driver muttered something about visibility and poor timing. Marcus looked out the window and saw through the gray morning haze a shop he didn't remember being on this street. It was a small, unremarkable brick exterior, a wooden door with a sign that simply read coffee in elegant script. Something about it pulled at his attention in a way he couldn't quite explain. Not the building itself, which was ordinary enough, but the feeling it projected. "Pull over," Marcus said. The driver glanced back, confused. "Sir, we're on schedule for the studio." "I know. Pull over anyway. I need coffee," Marcus answered. It wasn't true. There would be coffee at the studio, the expensive kind in silver carafes. But as if in a trance, Marcus heard himself insisting, and the driver complied. Marcus stepped out into the fog and crossed to the shop's entrance. The moment his hand touched the door handle, the city noise behind him seemed to vanish, and all he could hear was the soft sound of his own breathing. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was nothing like the coffee chains Marcus usually frequented between appointments. This place felt older, more settled, like it had existed long before the city grew up around it. Somehow, warm light filtered through the windows that showed only fog outside. Wooden tables with mismatched chairs were arranged in comfortable clusters. Bookshelves lined the walls, spines in languages Marcus recognized, and several he didn't. The air smelled rich and inviting. The shop was empty, except for a figure behind the counter. Marcus's first impression was that the person was younger than him, though that assessment shifted the longer he looked. Not younger, ageless perhaps, neither distinctly masculine nor feminine, with features that seemed to settle into focus only when Marcus concentrated on them directly. They wore simple clothes that could have belonged to any era, and they watched Marcus with eyes that reflected the warm light but revealed nothing else. "Welcome," the figure said, and their voice had the same quality as their appearance, like they were right there and Marcus could see their mouth moving, but somehow it was difficult to pin down where they were speaking from. "Please sit wherever you're comfortable." Marcus chose a table near the window without thinking about it. The chair was more comfortable than it looked. He set his phone face down on the table and realized he'd been holding tension in his shoulders that was finally starting to ease. The figure approached with a coffee pot and a cup, moving with quiet efficiency. They poured without asking if Marcus wanted any, and he didn't object. The coffee smelled perfect. "You seem troubled," the figure said. Marcus chuckled. "Is it that obvious? People don't usually find this place unless they're carrying something heavy." The figure returned the pot to the counter and came back empty-handed, taking the seat across from Marcus. "What are you carrying?" It was an invasive question from a stranger. Marcus should have deflected, should have smiled his public smile and said something charming and non-committal. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. "A choice I can't make," he said, "between being honest about who I am and keeping everything I've worked for." The figure tilted their head slightly. "Those seem like they should be compatible." "You'd think," Marcus agreed. "But the world doesn't work that way. At least not my world." "Your world," the figure repeated, as if testing the phrase. Marcus nodded. "I have been an actor for 7 years, successful by most measures, but it came with a cost. One of them is that I keep certain parts of my life hidden." "And you're tired of privacy?" the figure asked. "I'm tired of lying," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference. Privacy is choosing what to share. Lying is pretending to be someone you're not, because the truth would be inconvenient for other people's bottom lines." The figure was quiet for a moment, their expression unreadable. "What would honesty look like?" they finally asked. Marcus picked up the coffee cup, just to have something to do with his hands. The warmth of the ceramic was grounding. "Being true to who I am, while pursuing my dreams." "And the cost of that honesty?" they asked. "My career, probably. The franchise, certainly. The action roles that pay for everything," Marcus said. "So you want something impossible," the figure said. "To live openly while maintaining the same level of fame." "Yes," Marcus admitted. "I want the impossible." The figure stood and returned to the counter. Marcus watched them move, noting again how difficult it was to maintain focus on them directly. They prepared something behind the counter, Not more coffee, but something else. When they returned, they carried a tray with 3 small cups, each containing liquid that caught the light differently. There may be a way, the figure said, setting the tray on the table between them, but it requires an exchange. Marcus looked at the 3 cups. They appeared identical in size and shape, but the contents were different. One seemed to shimmer, almost vibrating with energy. Another was darker, more still, but with depth that suggested movement beneath the surface. The third was pale, almost translucent. Exchange of what? Marcus asked. That depends on what you choose. The figure gestured to the first cup, the shimmering one. This is immediate fulfillment. You drink this, and by tomorrow morning, what you want will be complete. You'll wake up having made the choice publicly. The world will know you as you are. The reaction will be overwhelmingly supportive. Your career will continue uninterrupted. You'll have everything you wanted, honesty and success together. Marcus stared at the cup. That's impossible. It's absolute, the figure corrected. Not impossible, but it requires the highest cost. What cost? Marcus asked one more. The figure met his eyes directly. Your sight. Marcus blinked. My what? Your ability to see. You would wake tomorrow having achieved perfect honesty, perfect acceptance, perfect continuation of your career, and you would be blind. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus opened his mouth to laugh, to dismiss this as some kind of elaborate joke, but the figure's expression stopped him. They weren't joking. You're telling me I can have everything I want, Marcus said slowly, if I'm willing to never see again. Yes, the figure simply replied. Marcus looked down at the other 2 cups, and those? The figure touched the second cup, the darker one. Gradual fulfillment. You drink this, and what you want unfolds over time. Months, perhaps a year. Your sight would fade slowly. It will give you more time to adapt and prepare. And the third? Marcus asked. Opportunity only. The figure's hand moved to the pale cup. This guarantees nothing, except possibilities. Doors will open that wouldn't have otherwise. Conversations will happen that might lead somewhere. You'll have chances to be honest that you don't currently have, but nothing is guaranteed. You will have to make the conscious decision yourself. Your sight would diminish partially, proportional to the opportunities that you take. Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was insane. This was impossible. He should stand up, thank this strange person for the coffee, and return to his car, where his driver was probably wondering what was taking so long. Instead, he asked, why sight specifically? The figure considered the question. You spent years being seen, they said, performing for cameras, for audiences, for the world. You want to be seen as you truly are. The exchange is symmetrical. To be finally, fully seen, you surrender the ability to see others. That's cruel, Marcus said, solemnly. It's a fair exchange, the figure replied neutrally. For you to get your wish, something must be given in return. The greater the wish, the greater the cost. Marcus looked at the 3 cups again. His phone buzzed on the table, probably his driver asking if everything was all right. He ignored it. What if I choose nothing? He asked. Then you leave and continue as you are. The shop won't appear to you again. And if I choose, Marcus's hand moved toward the shimmering cup before he'd fully made the decision. If I choose immediate fulfillment, if I give up my sight, you're telling me I'll wake up tomorrow and everything will be resolved, just like that? Yes. You'll wake up having made a public statement. The response will be supportive. Your career will adapt seamlessly. By tomorrow afternoon, you'll be living the honest life you want. Blind, Marcus added. Blind, the figure confirmed. Marcus wrapped his fingers around the cup. It was warm, almost hot, but not uncomfortably so. He thought about his schedule tomorrow, the photo shoot, the lunch meeting, the premiere preparation. He thought about 7 more years of this, or 17, or however long he could maintain the performance before it broke him completely. He thought about being 60 years old and still calculating every public appearance, still hiding, still exhausted. If I do this, Marcus said, will I regret it? The figure was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, they finally said. Regret requires comparing what is with what might have been. You'll only know one reality. Whether that reality feels worth the cost is something only you can determine. Marcus lifted the cup. The liquid inside caught the light, throwing small rainbows across the table's surface. It smelled like nothing, or like everything, impossible to identify specifically. Will it hurt? He asked. The loss of sight? No. You'll simply wake tomorrow and it will be gone, as if it had never been. Marcus thought about all the things he'd seen that mattered. Sunrises over the ocean. The first time he'd watched himself on screen and understood that he could actually do this, could actually make a career of pretending to be other people. The way light moved through water, the specific shade of blue in his favorite painting. He thought about all the things he'd see in the future if he kept his sight. His own aging, the world changing, the faces of people he hadn't met yet. And then he thought about living honestly, finally, without the weight of performance crushing him into someone he wasn't. He drank the entire cup in one long gulp. It tasted like water, the smoothest water he's ever tasted. The figure across from him watched without expression. Marcus set the empty cup down and waited for something to happen. A flash of light, a sense of change, anything. Nothing changed. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it," the figure confirmed. "Go home. Sleep. Tomorrow you'll understand." Marcus stood, feeling slightly unsteady, though whether it was from the drink or the magnitude of what he'd just done, he couldn't say. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't sure if gratitude was appropriate for this kind of transaction. The figure inclined their head slightly. "Live well with what you've chosen." Marcus left the shop and returned to his car. The driver asked if everything was all right, and Marcus said yes, he was fine. They could head to the studio now. He spent the rest of the morning's interview answering questions on autopilot, his mind elsewhere, wondering if he'd hallucinated the entire coffee shop encounter. By the time he returned to his hotel that evening, he'd almost convinced himself it hadn't been real. He fell asleep thinking about the fog and impossible exchanges and whether he'd lost his mind. Marcus woke to darkness. For a moment, he thought it was still night, that he'd woken too early. Then he realized his eyes were open. He blinked. Nothing changed. He sat up, reaching for his phone on the nightstand, or where he thought the nightstand was. His hand swept through empty air before finding the edge of the surface. The phone had been buzzing, he realized. He found it by touch and brought it to his ear, unable to look at who was calling. Marcus. His publicist's voice, sharp with something between excitement and panic. "Have you seen the news?" "No," Marcus said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "I can't see anything." A pause. "What do you mean you can't see anything?" "I mean I'm blind," Marcus said calmly, surprised he was not panicking. "Tell me what's happening." His publicist made a sound like she was trying to remember how to breathe. "You posted something last night, on all your social media. A statement, Marcus. You came out." The coffee shop had been real then. "What does it say?" Marcus asked. His publicist read it to him. It was exactly what Marcus would have written if he had the courage to write it himself. Honest, clear, no apologies, an explanation that he'd been afraid, that he was tired of being afraid, that he wanted to live truthfully. It struck the right balance between vulnerability and strength. The response? Marcus asked. Overwhelming support. "Your co-stars have all posted messages. The studio called, they're behind you completely. The franchise is safe. They want to make that clear. The director called it brave and said it makes you perfect for the role. Marcus, this is actually working. Everyone is being supportive," Marcus finished. "Yes, I thought they might be." "You thought?" his publicist said. "Did you plan this?" "In a way," Marcus said. He stood, navigating his hotel room by memory and touch. "I need you to help me with something." "Anything," the publicist replied. "I need someone who can help me learn to navigate without sight. I need to defer today's schedule." "Already done. I told them you were dealing with the statement fallout." "Tell them the truth," Marcus said. "Tell them I'm blind, and I need time to adjust. Tell them it won't affect my ability to work, but I need accommodations." Another pause. "Marcus, what happened?" "I made a choice," he said, "and I got what I wanted." Over the next few days, Marcus began learning a new way to exist in the world. His apartment became a geography of memory and careful movement. His team adapted with surprising speed. The studio hired specialists. His co-stars recorded audio descriptions of scripts. His publicist handled all his scheduling with precision. The media went insane with speculation about his vision loss. Some assumed it was related to the stress of coming out. Others theorized about medical conditions. A few suggested it was psychosomatic. What surprised Marcus most was how little he minded. He'd lost the ability to see color, to recognize faces, to watch sunrises or films, or his own reflection. But he'd gained something he'd been starving for. His mother visited 3 weeks after it happened. She held his hands and cried, and asked him why he hadn't told her he was losing his sight. "I didn't know until it happened," Marcus said, which was true in its way. "But you seem happy," she said, resigned. Yes, Marcus answered. I'm happy. She was quiet for a moment. I can hear it in your voice. You sound lighter than you have in years. She was right. The weight he'd been carrying, the constant vigilance, the exhausting performance was gone. He'd paid for that lightness with his sight, and some days he wondered if the trade had been worth it. But most days, when he woke up in darkness and remembered that he was finally, fully himself in the world, the answer felt clear. He'd been seen his entire career. Now he was known. And if the cost of being known was never seeing again, then perhaps that was simply the price of living truthfully.
Chapter 3. The tireless mother. Teresa Okonkwo had not slept a full night in 6 years. She had been on survival mode all this time and could recount some things by heart, like how many hours until her next shift, how many days until rent was due, how many years until her youngest started school. 6 years since her husband had left with a woman from his office and a promise to send child support that materialized approximately 40% of the time. 6 years of being the only parent to 3 children and a version of herself that had nothing left to give. She sat at her kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning, drinking instant coffee that had gone lukewarm while she'd been packing lunches. The apartment was quiet, a rare moment before her 8-year-old daughter woke up and needed breakfast, before her 6-year-old son remembered he had a project due today that he hadn't mentioned until last night, before her 3-year-old started crying for no apparent reason. Teresa had 45 minutes before the chaos began. She used it to review her budget spreadsheet, the numbers glowing accusingly on her laptop screen. Rent, $1,800, due in 12 days. Childcare, $400, due yesterday actually, but the daycare knew her situation and had agreed to let her pay Friday. Groceries, she had $80 left until payday. That would need to stretch 8 more days. Electricity, overdue. They'd sent a warning. Her car needed new tires. Her daughter needed glasses. The school had sent home a note 3 weeks ago about a vision screening. Her son's shoes were too small. She'd noticed him walking funny. Her youngest needed everything, diapers and clothes. The spreadsheet had a section at the bottom labeled "If Everything Goes Right." This was where Teresa tracked what her life might look like if she got the promotion her manager kept hinting about. More money, better hours, maybe even health insurance that didn't require her to choose between paying the premium and buying groceries. But the promotion kept not materializing, and Teresa kept running the numbers, trying to find a configuration that worked, and coming up empty every time. She loved her children. She needed to be clear about that, even in her own mind. She loved them desperately, completely, with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her. She would die for them without hesitation. She worked herself to exhaustion for them. She gave them everything she had. The problem was that everything she had wasn't enough. She worked 50 hours a week as a medical billing specialist, a job that paid adequately but not well, that required focus and precision, and left her brain fried by the time she got home. She worked weekends, doing bookkeeping for a small business owner who paid her under the table. Clothes her kids had outgrown. Anything that might bring in an extra $20. And still, every month the math didn't work. Every month she was choosing between paying bills on time and feeding her children properly. Every month she was one emergency away from complete disaster. Her daughter appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mama, I can't find my library book." "Did you check your backpack?" Teresa asked, closing the laptop before her daughter could see the spreadsheet and start asking questions about money. 8 years old, was too young to worry about whether they'd make rent. "I looked everywhere," she said. Teresa stood, her body protesting. She'd worked a double shift yesterday, her regular day at the billing office, then 6 hours of bookkeeping that had stretched until midnight. With the constant pain in her lower back, she said, "Let's look together." They found the library book under her daughter's bed, where it had apparently been serving as a prop in some elaborate game. Teresa added "library fine" to her mental list of expenses and reminded herself that at least her daughter liked reading. The morning unfolded in its usual chaos. Breakfast prepared and eaten in shifts because they didn't all fit at the table comfortably. Arguments about what clothes were clean enough to wear again. The 3-year-old refusing to get dressed and then melting down when Teresa tried to help. The 6-year-old asking for money for a field trip that cost $25 they didn't have. "I'll talk to your teacher," Teresa said, knowing she'd need to ask if there was a waiver form or some fund for families who couldn't afford the extras. She hated asking, hated the look of pity that always followed, but she'd learned to swallow pride for her children's sake. She dropped the older two at school, the youngest at daycare, and made it to work 17 minutes late. Her manager didn't comment, which Teresa knew meant she was using up goodwill she couldn't afford to lose. The day stretched endlessly, processing insurance claims while her mind wandered to everything waiting at home, grocery shopping after work, helping with homework, bath time for the youngest, who'd started resisting with impressive determination, laundry that had been piling up for 3 days, bills she needed to call about, arrangements she needed to make, problems she needed to solve. She ate lunch at her desk, crackers and an apple, while researching programs for low-income families, food assistance, utility help, anything that might ease the pressure even slightly. The applications were all complicated, required documentation she'd need to gather, and would take weeks to process, even if she qualified. Her phone rang during her afternoon break, displaying the daycare phone number. "Miss Okonkwo, I'm calling about this month's payment." "I have it," Teresa said. Teresa interrupted, keeping her voice low so her coworkers wouldn't overhear. "I'm getting paid Friday. I'll bring it then. We've been flexible, but we do need payment within the week, or we'll have to." "I understand. Thank you. I'll have it on Friday. I promise." She hung up and pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting back tears she didn't have time for. Friday was 3 days away. She had enough in her account to cover the daycare if she delayed paying the electric bill. Again. The afternoon crawled past. At 5 o'clock, she left to pick up her children, navigating traffic while her daughter asked if they could stop for ice cream, and her son complained about being hungry, while the 3-year-old screamed about something incomprehensible. Teresa said no to ice cream and handed back crackers from the emergency snack bag she kept in the car, and tried to tune out the screaming while she focused on not causing an accident. At home, there was dinner to make from ingredients that didn't quite constitute a meal, homework to supervise while simultaneously entertaining a toddler, dishes to wash while her daughter practiced piano on the keyboard Teresa had found at a thrift store, baths and teeth brushing, and bedtime stories. By 9 o'clock, all 3 children were finally asleep. Teresa sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her phone. 7 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, probably a debt collector about the medical bill from when her son had needed stitches. Texts from her mother asking if she needed help, which Teresa appreciated but couldn't accept because her mother was on a fixed income and had her own problems. A message from her ex-husband, "Can't send support this month. Things are tight." Teresa deleted it without responding. She should sleep. She had to be up in 7 hours to do this all over again. But she found herself sitting in the dark, running numbers in her head, trying to find a solution that didn't exist. She loved her children. She would do anything for them, but she was so tired of never being enough. Teresa found the coffee shop on a Tuesday morning that felt like every other day. She'd overslept, rare enough to be alarming, and was rushing through her morning routine when she realized she'd run out of coffee. The instant coffee she could barely afford and definitely couldn't function without. She needed it to survive the billing office, needed it to stay awake during the evening bookkeeping gig, needed it to be even minimally patient with her children. She should skip it. She was already late. But something made her grab her keys and leave 5 minutes earlier than necessary, telling herself she'd just run through the drive-thru at the chain on the corner. Except when she turned onto the street where the chain should have been, she saw fog instead. Thick and unusual for this time of morning, rolling across the intersection in ways that didn't match the wind direction. And through it, a shop she'd never noticed before. The sign simply read, "Coffee," in script that seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking directly at it. Teresa pulled into a parking space that appeared at exactly the right moment and checked her watch. She really didn't have time for this. But something about the shop pulled at her attention with unusual insistence. So she went inside. The interior was warm and quiet and smelled like coffee in a way that made her chest ache with something adjacent to homesickness. Wooden tables, mismatched chairs, shelves full of books. Everything worn and comfortable and settled in ways that made her want to sit down and never get up. A figure stood behind the counter. Teresa's first impression was that they were young, though that shifted when she looked more carefully. Maybe they were older than they appeared. They watched her with a calm expression. "Welcome," they said. "Please, sit." "I don't really have time," Teresa started. Sit anyway, the figure said, and somehow Teresa found herself in a chair by the window, her purse in her lap, her hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and caffeine withdrawal, and the constant pressure of holding everything together. The figure brought coffee without asking what she wanted. Teresa accepted it and took a sip. It was perfect. Exactly the temperature and strength she preferred, which should have been strange, but somehow wasn't. You look tired, the figure observed. Teresa laughed, short and sharp. That's diplomatic. I look exhausted. How come? The figure asked. The question was simple, but somehow opened something in Teresa's chest. Because I have 3 children, and no help, and not enough money, and not enough time, and I'm failing at everything simultaneously. I am working 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when I can find extra hours, and it's still not enough. Teresa set down her coffee cup and continued venting, even though this stranger couldn't possibly help. It always boils down to money. I need money. Enough that I'm not choosing between paying the light bill or feeding my children. And time, the figure stated. And also time, Teresa repeated. God, yes. Time to actually be with my kids instead of just going through the motions around them. Time to help with homework without feeling like I'm going to collapse. Time to be a mother. The figure was quiet for a moment. If you could have both financial security and time, what would you give up for it? Teresa almost laughed again. What wouldn't I give? I'd give anything to not feel like I'm drowning. Anything to give my kids the life they deserve. Anything is a broad category, the figure said. They stood and moved behind the counter, preparing something Teresa couldn't see. Would you give your capacity for warmth? My what? The figure returned with a tray holding 3 small cups. The part of you that feels tenderness, affection. The emotional softness that makes love feel like something more than obligation. Teresa stared at the cups. They looked identical but held different liquids, one shimmering with energy, one darker and still, one pale and barely there. I don't understand, she said. You want financial security and time with your children, the figure explained. I can provide that, but it will come at a cost. The cost for what you're asking is your heart, not the organ, but the faculty. Your ability to feel warmth, tenderness, affection. You're telling me I'd stop loving my children? Teresa's voice went sharp with sudden anger. No, the figure said calmly. You would still care for them. You would still protect them, provide for them, fulfill all the responsibilities of a mother. You simply wouldn't feel the emotional component of love. It would become rather procedural. Teresa looked at the cups again. This was insane. This stranger was offering her a devil's bargain, if devils offered coffee, and spoke calmly about impossible exchanges. She should leave. She should grab her purse and walk out and pretend this conversation had never happened. Instead, she asked, what are the 3 options? The figure gestured to the first cup, the shimmering one. Immediate fulfillment. You drink this, and by tomorrow morning, everything changes. Financial security arrives as an inheritance, an unexpected windfall, something that resolves your money problems completely. Your work schedule adjusts. You have time with your children. But your capacity for emotional warmth disappears entirely the moment you wake up tomorrow. They touch the second cup. Gradual fulfillment. The changes unfold over months. As your situation improves, your emotional capacity fades proportionally. Their hand moved to the third cup. Opportunity only. Doors open that wouldn't have otherwise. Better job prospects, financial assistance programs you qualify for, schedules that align better. Your warmth diminishes partially, but not completely. No guarantees, but possibilities you don't currently have. You will begin to lose your emotional attachments as you seize opportunities. Teresa wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the shop's warmth. Why would anyone choose to lose the ability to feel love? Because feeling love doesn't pay rent, the figure said neutrally. Because warmth doesn't put food on the table. Sometimes survival requires sacrificing the things we hold dear. That's horrible, she said. It's a fair exchange, the figure replied. You decide if it's worth it. Teresa thought about her children, about her daughter who still crawled into bed with her during thunderstorms, about her son who drew pictures for her at school and presented them like precious gifts, about her youngest who reached for her whenever Teresa entered a room, that absolute trust and need that made her chest ache. She thought about loving them with the fierce, consuming intensity that made their pain unbearable and their joy transcendent, about the way her heart expanded when they laughed and shattered when they cried. And then she thought about the spreadsheet, about the bills and the anxiety and the constant grinding exhaustion, about working herself into the ground and still not being enough, about her daughter needing glasses, and her son needing shoes, and having to choose which necessity to address first. She thought about 10 more years of this, or 20, however long until they were grown and gone, and she could finally rest. If I choose immediate fulfillment, Teresa said slowly, they'll be taken care of? Really taken care of? Yes, the figure confirmed. You'll have the resources and time to provide everything they need. But I won't feel warmth, tenderness, but you'll care for them perfectly. Teresa reached for the shimmering cup. Her hand shook. Will I regret it? She asked. I don't know, the figure said. Regret requires comparing realities. You'll only know one. Will they know? Will my children know something's missing? The figure was quiet for a long moment. Children are perceptive, they finally said. They may sense a change. Whether they would understand is difficult to say. Teresa lifted the cup. The liquid inside caught the light, throwing small rainbows across the worn table. She thought about her daughter's face when Teresa read bedtime stories, her son's excitement when she helped with homework, her youngest's absolute certainty that Mama could fix anything. She thought about being able to fix things, actually fix them, with money and time and presence instead of just empty promises. She drank with her eyes closed. What happens now? Teresa asked. Go home, sleep. Tomorrow you'll understand. Teresa stood, feeling steadier than she had in months. Thank you, she said. The figure inclined their head. Live well with what you've chosen. Teresa left the shop and drove to work. She was 30 minutes late, but her manager didn't comment. She processed insurance claims with her usual precision and left exactly at 5 o'clock to pick up her children. That evening unfolded normally. Dinner, homework, baths, bedtime. Her children were themselves demanding, exhausting, perfect. Teresa went through the motions with practiced efficiency and fell asleep thinking about budgets and coffee shops and impossible promises. Teresa woke to her phone ringing, a lawyer's office. They needed to speak with her about an inheritance from an uncle she barely remembered, her father's brother, who'd lived alone, and apparently left his entire estate to his only niece when he passed away last month. The amount was enough to pay off every debt, cover a year's expenses, and leave a substantial cushion for emergencies. By noon, Teresa had confirmation after meeting with the lawyer. By evening, she'd given notice at her second job. By the end of the week, she'd rearranged her primary work schedule to reasonable hours, enrolled her children in better programs, and bought her daughter the glasses she needed. Everything the coffee shop had promised materialized exactly as described, and Teresa felt nothing about any of it. She noticed the change gradually over the first few days. Her daughter brought home a painting from school, presented it with the eager anticipation that usually made Teresa's heart swell. Teresa looked at it, said, "This is very good. You worked hard on this," and put it on the refrigerator with the others. Her daughter's face fell slightly, searching for something in Teresa's expression that wasn't there. Her son scraped his knee at the playground. He came to her crying, and Teresa cleaned the wound, applied a bandage, and said, "You're all right. Be more careful next time." He stopped crying quickly, but something in his eyes suggested he'd expected more. Comfort, maybe. It started being hard to tell. Her youngest reached for her during nap time, that automatic gesture of a toddler seeking safety. Teresa picked her up, settled her in the crib, patted her back until she settled. The routine was identical to before. Teresa noticed these moments clinically, the way she might notice data points in a spreadsheet. She understood intellectually that something had changed, but she felt nothing about the change. No guilt, no grief, no second thoughts. She was a better mother now in every measurable way. She had time to help with homework without exhaustion making her irritable. She had money to buy healthy food and new clothes and educational toys. She was present at school events. She maintained the apartment better. She never yelled because nothing triggered the kind of overwhelmed frustration she felt before. She did everything right. But her daughter stopped bringing her paintings after the third one received the same neutral response. Her son stopped coming to her when he was hurt, preferring to handle minor injuries himself. Her youngest still reached for her during nap time, but stopped making the happy sounds she used to make when Teresa picked her up. Other people noticed too. The daycare provider mentioned that Teresa seemed calmer, in a way that sounded like concern rather than compliment. Her mother visited and spent the whole time watching Teresa with troubled eyes, finally asking, "Are you all right? You seem different." "I'm fine," Teresa said, and meant it. Better than fine. Everything's working now. But you don't seem happy about it. Teresa considered that. "I'm satisfied," she said instead. The kids are taken care of. That's what matters. Her mother left looking unconvinced. One evening, nearly a year after the coffee shop, her daughter asked, "Mama, do you love us?" Teresa was folding laundry. She paused, considering how to answer. "Of course I do," she said, because that was what mothers said. "But do you feel it?" Her daughter pressed, with the terrible perceptiveness of children. Teresa looked at her daughter, 8 years old, smart, sensitive, desperate for something Teresa could no longer provide. She could say yes and hold her daughter and perform the warmth that should accompany the words. "I take care of you," Teresa said instead. "I will make sure you have everything you need. That's what love is." Her daughter's face crumpled. "That's not the same." "No," Teresa agreed. "But it's reliable." Her daughter cried, and Teresa handed her tissues and waited for the crying to stop. Later, after the children were asleep, Teresa sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd reviewed her desperate budgets a year ago. The spreadsheet on her laptop showed surplus now. Everything was green, paid, managed, secure. She closed the laptop and sat in the quiet apartment. Her children were safe. They had everything they needed materially. They sensed something was missing, but they were children. They would adapt. Whether that was enough, Teresa couldn't say.
I hope you are enjoying this story so far. Let me know in the comments below. Would you make the same choices as Marcus and Teresa if you were in their position? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 4. The Brave Boy. Daniel Reeves learned early that some children were chosen and others were not. He fell into the second category. By the time he was 11 years old, he learned how to survive on his own. Even at school, he was last picked for teams in gym class, last considered for group projects, last invited to birthday parties, if invited at all. The mathematics of social hierarchy were clear, even when the reasons behind them remained mysterious. He wasn't particularly strange, as far as he could tell. He didn't smell bad, or say inappropriate things, or have any obvious defects that would explain his position at the bottom of every social structure. He was just unremarkable. Average height, average looks, average intelligence. The kind of kid teachers struggled to remember, even when he sat in the front row and turned in every assignment on time. Daniel lived in a group home on the east side of the city, one of 8 children, rotating through a system that tried its best, but operated on funding that never quite stretched far enough. His caseworker was kind, but overworked, responsible for 43 kids across 6 facilities. The house parents were well-meaning, but exhausted, focused primarily on keeping everyone fed and safe. Daniel had been in the system since he was 6, when his mother had been arrested for possession and his father couldn't be located. He remembered very little about that time, just fragments of an apartment that smelled like cigarettes, and a mother who sometimes forgot he existed. The group home was sadly a better environment. He got regular meals, clean clothes, and adults who didn't disappear for days at a time. Daniel attended public school with children who had families, houses, parents who attended conferences, and complained about homework. He did his assignments in the group home's common room, while the other kids watched television or fought over video game controllers. He kept his backpack organized, and his pencils sharp, and his notebook pages neat, because those were things he could control when everything else felt arbitrary and chaotic. None of it mattered, though, at the end of the day. The other kids at school knew he was from the group home. Some had decided that was enough reason to make his life miserable. Daniel had tried, in the beginning, tried to join conversations, to sit at tables during lunch, to smile and make jokes, and do all the things that seemed to come naturally to children who were popular. But his attempts landed awkwardly, and most often made him a target for bullying and ridicule. So he stopped trying. By 5th grade, he had a routine that minimized interaction, and therefore minimized opportunities for rejection. He arrived at school exactly on time, not early enough to stand around awkwardly before class. He sat in his assigned seat, and completed his work without raising his hand, unless called on directly. At lunch, he found empty tables, or sat at the end of occupied ones, close enough to look like he belonged somewhere, but far enough that no one felt obligated to include him. During recess, he read books on the bench near the playground equipment. His report cards consistently noted that he was well-behaved and capable of working independently. Occasionally someone would write, "Encourage peer interaction" in the comment section, but these suggestions were never followed up on with any concrete action. Daniel told himself he didn't mind. Being alone was better than trying to belong, and being reminded constantly that you didn't. Books were better companions. But deep down, he knew that he did mind. He minded desperately, with an ache that lived in his chest, and intensified every time he watched other kids laughing together. Every time he overheard plans being made that didn't include him. Every time someone looked through him like he was furniture rather than a person. He wanted more than anything to be chosen, to be liked, and to belong somewhere. He wanted to matter to someone. The worst part was how arbitrary it all seemed. He'd watched less kind children be popular. He'd seen kids who were meaner, louder, more disruptive, get invited to things, while he remained invisible. Whatever quality made someone likable, Daniel apparently lacked it entirely, and no amount of trying had helped him acquire it. Daniel found the coffee shop on a Saturday morning in October. The group home's weekend routine involved getting everyone fed breakfast, and then dispersed to various activities, like structured programs for the younger kids, volunteer opportunities for the older ones, and nominal free time for those in the middle, like Daniel. He usually spent Saturdays at the public library, which had air conditioning in summer and heat in winter. This Saturday, he'd left the house earlier than necessary because one of the other residents had been in a mood, and Daniel had learned to remove himself before things escalated. The morning was foggy, unusual for October, thick enough that he could barely see across the street. He was walking toward the bus stop when he noticed the coffee shop. It sat on a corner he passed every Saturday, but he'd never seen it before. Daniel hesitated, but decided to check it out. The interior was warm and peaceful. Comfortable chairs, soft lighting, the smell of coffee mixed with something like cinnamon or vanilla. Empty except for a figure behind the counter, who looked up when he entered. "Welcome," they said. Their voice was gentle. "Come in, sit down." Daniel hesitated. "I don't have money for coffee." "That's all right," the figure said. "Sit anyway." Daniel chose a chair near the window and set his backpack beside it. The figure came around the counter, carrying a cup of something that steamed gently. They set it on the small table beside Daniel's chair. "Hot chocolate," they explained. "You look like you could use something warm." Daniel wrapped his hands around the cup and took a sip. It was perfect. Exactly the right temperature. Exactly sweet enough. "Thank you," he said quietly. The figure sat in the chair across from him. "You seem sad." Daniel shrugged, an automatic deflection. "I'm fine." "Are you?" the figure asked. "Not really," Daniel admitted, "but I'm used to it." "Used to what?" the figure inquired. "Being by myself," Daniel said nonchalantly. The figure was quiet for a moment. "Nothing is wrong with being alone, though." Daniel considered that. "I guess. But that's not the same as other people not wanting you around." "No," the figure agreed. "It's not. Do you want people to pay attention to you?" "Yes," Daniel said, and the word came out more desperate than he'd intended. "I want people to like me. I want to have friends. I want to be included in things instead of just watching everyone else." "What would you give for that?" the figure asked. Daniel thought about it. "Anything. Everything. I'd give anything to not be alone anymore." "Anything is a strong word," the figure said. They stood and moved to the counter, returning with a tray holding 3 small cups. "Would you give up your voice?" Daniel blinked. "My what?" "Your ability to speak. To verbally express wants, needs, boundaries, protest." The 3 cups sat on the tray between them. "I don't understand," Daniel said. The figure gestured to the cups. "You want to be liked, to belong, to be chosen. I can arrange that, but the cost for what you're asking is your voice, and let me be clear. What I want is not just your physical ability to make sounds, but the capacity to advocate for yourself, to refuse, to protest when you're mistreated." "But," Daniel struggled to process this, "if I can't say no, people could hurt me." "Yes," the figure confirmed. "They could. They might not. But you wouldn't be able to stop them by communicating with them if they did." "Then why would I agree to this?" "Because you want to belong, more than you want protection," the figure said neutrally. "Because being liked feels more important than being safe. Because loneliness hurts more than most things you can imagine." Daniel looked at the 3 cups. This was insane. This stranger was offering him a deal with a terrible cost. He should leave. But he didn't move. "What are the 3 options?" he asked instead. The figure went over the 3 options. Daniel stared at the cups. "If I can't say no, but everyone likes me, what happens if someone's mean to me?" "You won't be able to protest," the figure said. "You won't be able to tell anyone it happened. You won't be able to ask for help. But people will like me." "Yes, but let me warn you, being liked and being safe are entirely different things," the figure said. Daniel thought about his days at school, the lunch table where he sat alone, and then he thought about how happy he would be if he was liked, having friends who actually wanted him around. He asked, "Losing my voice, I mean?" "Not physically. You'll simply find yourself unable to express some things. It will feel natural, like you're choosing silence, even when you're not. But I'll be happy. If people like me, I'll be happy, Daniel said softly. The figure was quiet for a long moment. Happiness requires more than being liked, they finally said. But you'll have what you're asking for. Daniel reached for the middle cup. The gradual fulfillment. Not the immediate change that felt too terrifying. Not the uncertain opportunity that sounded too much like his current situation, with minor improvements. But something in between. Are you certain? The figure asked, as Daniel was lifting the cup. Daniel thought about going back to the group home, and going back to school remaining alone, and knew he had already made a decision. Yes, he said. I'm certain. He drank the entire cup. It tasted like sweet tea. Go about your day. The changes will come gradually. You'll notice people treating you differently, including you, liking you. By the time your voice is gone, your wish will have already come true. Daniel left the shop and walked to the library, his usual Saturday destination. He spent the day reading and feeling excited. The changes started small. On Monday morning, a girl in his class smiled at him in the hallway. Hey Daniel, she said, like they'd been friends all along. At lunch, someone called his name from across the cafeteria. Daniel, come sit here, we have room. During gym class he was picked third for basketball. This was unbelievable. Daniel was on cloud 9. Daniel waited for the other shoe to drop, for someone to reveal this was an elaborate prank. But the kindness continued. People genuinely seemed to like him. It felt miraculous. It felt like everything he'd ever wanted. The first time his voice was gone, he didn't recognize what was happening. A boy in his class, Tyler, one of the popular kids who'd started including Daniel in things, was copying Daniel's homework during the morning before class. Daniel wanted to say no, wanted to explain that he'd get in trouble if they were caught, wanted to protest in any way. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "Sure, no problem." Tyler grinned. "Thanks, man, you're the best." Daniel told himself it wasn't a big deal. It was just homework. Tyler was his friend now, or something like a friend. Friends helped each other. It was fine. The second time was worse. A girl invited him to a study group at the library on Saturday, but Saturday was the time he'd always kept for himself. Daniel wanted to say he had plans, wanted to explain that he needed that time alone, but he heard himself say, "Sure, that sounds great," before he'd consciously decided to respond. He went to the study group. It was loud and chaotic, and he couldn't concentrate. Included him in the conversation. Treated him like he belonged. So it was worth it. Probably. The incidents accumulated slowly over the next few weeks, each one small enough to dismiss individually, but adding up to a pattern Daniel couldn't ignore. Someone asked to borrow money, $5, not a lot, and Daniel said yes, even though he only got a $10 weekly allowance from the group home and needed that money for things he actually wanted. A group of kids decided to skip afternoon classes and pressured Daniel to come along. He didn't want to. He knew he'd get in trouble. But he found himself nodding and following them, unable to voice the refusal sitting in his throat. But people liked him now. Teachers praised him for being cooperative. Other kids called him easygoing, chill, a good friend. The breaking point came 3 months after the coffee shop. Daniel had been adopted into a friend group with 5 other kids from school who did everything together. He was grateful for them, genuinely. They included him, laughed at his jokes when he occasionally made them, invited him to sleepovers and movies, and the kind of casual hangouts he'd always observed as an outsider. But one of them, Marcus, the unofficial leader, had started testing boundaries in ways that made Daniel increasingly uncomfortable. Small things at first. Taking Daniel's snacks without asking. Making jokes at Daniel's expense that everyone laughed at. Volunteering Daniel for tasks no one else wanted to do. Daniel laughed along because everyone else was laughing. They were at Marcus's house on a Friday evening. Marcus's older brother had left beer in the garage refrigerator. Marcus pulled out a 6-pack and started distributing cans. "Come on, it'll be fun. My brother won't notice." Everyone took one. Daniel didn't want one. He'd seen what alcohol did with his mother, and the group home had counselors who talked about making good choices and avoiding risks. But when Marcus held out a can, Daniel took it. "I don't really want to," he started, but the words died. What came out instead was, "Thanks." "Don't be boring," Marcus said. "Everyone's doing it." Daniel opened the can because everyone else was opening theirs. Took a sip because they were all watching. Drank more than he wanted because he couldn't figure out how to stop once he'd started. The evening blurred. Someone suggested they go to the park down the street. Daniel wanted to go home. He felt sick and dizzy. But he followed the group because following was all he could do. At the park, Marcus dared Daniel to climb to the top of the playground equipment. It was high. the kind of height that would hurt if he fell. Daniel was afraid of heights, had been since he was small. I don't think, he started. Don't be a coward, Marcus interrupted. Unless you're too scared? Everyone was watching, waiting to see if Daniel would do it, if he was cool enough. So Daniel climbed. He made it halfway up before his foot slipped. He caught himself, fingers tight on cold metal, heart hammering with fear. He wanted to climb down, wanted to say he'd had enough. This was stupid, he was done. But he kept climbing. At the top, swaying slightly, sick and dizzy and terrified, Daniel looked down at his friends. They were laughing. Not cruel laughter exactly, but not kind either. And Daniel realized they didn't actually like him. They liked that he'd do whatever they asked. They liked that he never complained, never refused, never made himself inconvenient. They liked having someone they could use. Daniel climbed down carefully, fighting back tears. When he reached the ground, Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. See, that wasn't so hard. Daniel wanted to go home. But when Marcus said, let's go back to my house, Daniel said, okay, and followed. It took 2 more weeks before Daniel went back to the coffee shop. He hadn't been planning to, hadn't been sure he could even find it again. But one Saturday morning, walking toward the library through fog that came from nowhere, he saw the familiar sign. Coffee. He pushed open the door. The interior was exactly as he remembered. The figure behind the counter looked up, that same unreadable expression. I am not supposed to allow you back in, but as I went through my journals, I decided to bend the rules just this once, they said. I want to undo it, Daniel said. The trade. I want my voice back. The figure was quiet for a moment. That's not how the exchange works. What's given can't be returned. But it's not fair, Daniel protested. People don't actually like me. They just like that I can't say no. They like you, the figure corrected. They also take advantage of you. Both things can be true. Daniel felt tears going down his cheeks. I'm not happy. You said I'd get what I wanted, but I'm not happy. I said you'd be liked, that you'd belong. Are you not? The figure replied. It's not enough, Daniel said, his voice breaking. Being liked isn't enough if people hurt you and take advantage of you. The figure came around the counter and sat in the chair across from Daniel. You chose gradual fulfillment, they said. The process isn't complete yet. Your voice is fading, but it's not gone yet. You still have pieces of it. Daniel shook his head. The pieces don't work. I try to say no and different words come out. I try to protest and I just agree instead. The faculty fades in order of priority, the figure explained. Personal boundaries first, protest second, expression of needs last. What remains is the ability to observe, to understand, to recognize what's happening, even when you can't stop it. That's worse, Daniel said. Knowing something's wrong, but not being able to say it is worse than not knowing. The figure was quiet. Yes, they finally agreed. It probably is. Daniel wiped his eyes. Why did you let me choose this? I didn't understand what I was giving up. You understood enough, the figure said. You knew the cost. You decided belonging was worth it. I was wrong, Daniel whispered. Or, perhaps, belonging is worth it, and the cost is simply higher than you anticipated, the figure said. Daniel slumped in his chair. What do I do now? You live with your choice. You learn to protect yourself in ways that don't require a voice. You become careful about who you spend time with. You find people who will notice when you can't advocate for yourself, and who will do it on your behalf. That's not fair, Daniel said, crying. The exchange is balanced, the figure said. Daniel sat there for a long time, crying quietly, while the figure waited patiently. Eventually, he wiped his face and stood up. I should go, he said. Before you do, the figure said, I'll tell you something. The trade doesn't prevent others from speaking for you. It prevents you from advocating for yourself. But it doesn't stop you from finding people who'll notice when something's wrong. How am I supposed to find people like that? Daniel protested. The same way anyone finds good people. Carefully and with trial and error, by watching how they treat you when you're vulnerable. Daniel left the coffee shop and walked to the library. He sat in his usual corner and thought about the figure's words. Over the next few months, Daniel learned to navigate his new reality. He stopped spending time with Marcus's group, finding excuses, real ones that didn't require saying no directly to avoid their invitations. He started paying attention to how people treated him when he couldn't refuse them. Some days, when he was included in things that made him genuinely happy, it felt worth it. Other days, when he found himself trapped in situations he couldn't escape, it felt like the worst decision he'd ever made. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Loved. Eleanor Price turned 63 in April. Alone in her apartment, with a slice of store-bought cake, and the awareness that this was exactly how she'd spend every birthday for the rest of her life, unless something fundamental changed. She wasn't bitter about it exactly. Bitterness required a sense of injustice, and Eleanor had long since accepted that her solitude was mostly her own fault. Not in the sense that she'd done anything wrong, but in the sense that she'd made choices that prioritized other things over partnership, and those choices had consequences that accumulated over decades until they became your entire life. She'd been married once, briefly, in her early 20s. It had lasted 3 years before ending in a divorce that was amicable enough, but also revealed a fundamental incompatibility neither of them had noticed during the courtship. He'd wanted children immediately. She'd wanted to finish graduate school. He'd needed someone emotionally available. She'd been buried in research and was barely present at home. They'd parted without drama, but also without much regret. And Eleanor had told herself there would be time for relationships later, after she'd established her career. She spent her 30s building a career in academic research, working 70-hour weeks in a laboratory studying cellular biology. The work was fascinating and consuming, and left very little energy for dating. She'd had occasional relationships, brief things that fizzled when her partners realized they'd always be secondary to her research, or when she realized she wasn't interested enough in them to rearrange her schedule. Her 40s had been similar. A few relationships, none lasting longer than a year. By then, she'd achieved most of her career goals: tenure, publications, respect in her field. She'd started to think about partnership more seriously, and started making more effort to maintain one. But the men she met at her age were complicated divorcees with children, or so set in their patterns that accommodating another person felt impossible. In her 50s, she dated less. The pool of available partners had shrunk. The men who were interested in 60-year-old women often wanted caretakers for their declining years rather than actual partners. The few who seemed genuinely interested in companionship turned out to have qualities that made long-term partnership less appealing, like expectations about traditional gender roles that Eleanor had spent her whole life refusing. She'd stopped actively looking around 58. Now at 63, she'd accepted that she would probably spend the rest of her life without a partner. Not unhappily, as she had friends, interests, and work that still engaged, even in semi-retirement. Maybe if she'd met the right people at different points in her life, when she'd had more flexibility, or less career focus, or different priorities. Maybe there was no flaw in her, just unfortunate misalignments of circumstance and readiness. Eleanor finished her cake, and washed the plate, and went to bed thinking about the probabilities, and whether 63 was too old to still hope for companionship. She found the coffee shop 3 weeks later. Eleanor was walking to the farmer's market, her Saturday routine for the past 5 years. Something to structure her weekend and provide social interaction, even if it was just pleasant small talk with vendors. The fog made navigation difficult. She turned down a street she thought led to the market, and instead found a coffee shop she'd never noticed before. Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't lost exactly, but the fog was disorienting enough that she wouldn't mind sitting down and getting her bearings. She pushed open the door. The interior was immediately impossibly comforting. A figure stood behind the counter. "Welcome," they said. "Please sit." Eleanor chose a chair and set her bag beside it. The figure approached with a coffee pot and poured. Eleanor accepted the cup and took a sip. "You seem thoughtful," the figure observed, taking the seat across from her. Eleanor smiled slightly. "Is it that obvious? People don't usually find this place unless they're carrying something they want to change." "I'm 63, Eleanor said. "Most of what I'd want to change is decades in the past and can't be undone." "You'd be surprised," the figure said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, but something about the shop and the fog urged her to share her wish. "I'd like to be loved," she said simply. "Not romantically necessarily, though that would be nice. Just partnership, companionship. Someone who chooses to share life with me." "What stopped you from finding that?" the figure asked. Eleanor laughed, short and not quite bitter. "Time, mostly. Choices I made when I was younger. Prioritizing career over relationships. Being too selective, or not selective enough. Bad timing with good people. Good timing with bad people. All the usual reasons people end up alone." "And now?" the figure asked. "Now I'm 63, and the probability of finding genuine connection at my age feels vanishingly small." She paused. "I've only recently admitted to myself that I might be interested in women as partners while thinking about my past relationships with men, which feels like poor timing for that particular revelation." The figure tilted their head slightly. "Would you like to change that probability?" "Change how probable it is that I find love?" Eleanor asked.
That seems like something outside anyone's control. Not necessarily, the figure said. The figure stood and moved to the counter, returning with a tray holding 3 small cups. I can arrange that quite easily. Eleanor looked at the 3 cups with a suspicious look. What kind of potential? She asked carefully. Love, partnership, and genuine connection. The specifics would depend on which option you choose. The figure gestured to the first cup. This is for immediate fulfillment. You drink this and within days you will meet someone. The connection is instant, mutual, and lasting. You have the partnership you're looking for. They touched the second cup. Gradual fulfillment. The connection will not be instant. It will require effort on your part. It will be mutual but will take time to materialize. Their hand moved to the third cup. Opportunity only. This guarantees nothing except possibility. You will have various encounters. Whether they develop into actual connections depends on choices you both make. Eleanor studied the cups. What's the catch? Your lifespan, the figure said simply. To be more precise, some years of your remaining lifespan. And before you ask, no, I cannot tell you how long you have left. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. How many years? That depends on what you choose. Immediate fulfillment costs the most, 10 years. Gradual fulfillment costs less, 7 years. Opportunity only costs the least, on average 3 years. You're asking me to trade years of my life for the possibility of love, Eleanor said accusingly. Yes, the figure simply answered. That seems, Eleanor paused, searching for the right word. Steep. Is it? The figure asked. You've already spent 63 years getting to this point. How many of those years have been diminished by loneliness? How many will be in the future, if nothing changes? Eleanor wanted to argue, but the question landed with uncomfortable accuracy. She thought about the last decade, going through the motions of a life with unsatisfactory yearning. If I choose immediate fulfillment, she said carefully, I'd lose 10 years. I'm 63 now, I'll have less time to enjoy it. Yes, the figure simply answered. And if I choose opportunity only, I will only lose a couple years, but have no guarantee I'd actually find love? Correct. Opportunity provides potential, not certainty. You'd have chances you don't currently have. Whether those chances become reality depends on choices made by you and whoever you might meet. Eleanor picked up the pale cup, the opportunity-only option. Then she set it down and picked up the shimmering cup instead. 10 years for certain love. I'm 63, she said again, as if the number itself was an argument. I don't have decades to gamble with. No one does, the figure said. Not really. Young people believe they do, but time is uncertain for everyone. That's not comforting, Eleanor said. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true, the figure replied. Eleanor set down the dark cup and picked up the pale one again. If I choose this opportunity only, would that be better? No guarantees, the figure confirmed. Eleanor thought about 10 more years alone, about 20 more years, potentially, if she maintained decent health. She thought about her ex-husband, now remarried and by all accounts happy, about friends who'd built lives with partners and were now navigating aging together, about the small, constant ache of having no one to go back home to. If I choose this, Eleanor said slowly, and I meet someone, and it develops into actual love, how will I know if it's real? How will I know it's not just the magic of the trade? Because opportunity only doesn't create feelings, the figure explained. It creates circumstances. The feelings, if they develop, are entirely genuine. You meet someone you wouldn't have met otherwise. You have a conversation that wouldn't have happened. The rest is authentic human connection. Eleanor nodded slowly. That felt important. She'd rather have one real relationship than a manufactured one. What about the time I lose? She asked. Will I notice? Will I wake up feeling years older? No. You'll simply have less time remaining than you did before. You won't feel the loss. You'll just have fewer years ahead, and you won't know exactly how many fewer. That's frightening, Eleanor admitted. Yes, the figure agreed. Most costs are. Eleanor picked up the pale cup again. In her other hand she'd somehow acquired the dark cup, gradual fulfillment. More certainty, more years of her life. She looked between them. The sensible choice was obvious. She was 63. She couldn't afford to gamble 10 years on anything, certainly not on love that might not even suit her once she had it. Opportunity only. With the reduced cost and the increased potential, it felt like the only choice that made sense. This one, Eleanor said, setting down the dark cup and holding the pale one. I choose opportunity only. Are you certain? The figure asked. Eleanor thought about that. Was she certain about anything? She'd spent her entire life making choices with imperfect information, pursuing goals that seemed right at the time, and sometimes were, and sometimes weren't. No, she said honestly, but I'm choosing it anyway. What happens now? Eleanor asked. You live your life. You'll notice when the opportunities present themselves, like conversations that wouldn't have happened, meetings that feel surprisingly convenient. The rest is up to you. Eleanor left the shop and found herself on the street she'd been looking for, the farmer's market visible just ahead. The fog was lifting. She walked through the market in a daze, buying vegetables she barely looked at, trying to process what had just happened. The first opportunity appeared 3 days later. Eleanor was at the local bookstore, her Tuesday routine, returning books and browsing new releases. She reached for a biography at the same moment someone else did, and their hands collided awkwardly. Oh, I'm sorry, Eleanor started. No, please, you were here first, the other woman said. The woman was perhaps a few years older than Eleanor, with silver hair cut short and intelligent eyes behind reading glasses. We could both read it, Eleanor suggested. If you'd like to, we can then discuss it sometime. I've been looking for an excuse to join a book club, but they all seem to read things I'm not interested in. The woman smiled. I have the same problem. I'm Catherine, by the way. Eleanor. They talked for 20 minutes in the library aisle, discovering they'd both been researching similar scientific topics. Catherine was a retired chemistry professor. They exchanged phone numbers with tentative plans to meet for coffee the following week. Eleanor left the library feeling lighter than she had in months. The coffee meeting turned into lunch the following week. Lunch turned into a museum visit 2 weeks later. Museum visits became a standing midweek routine. By June, Eleanor realized she'd been spending most of her free time with Catherine and feeling more engaged with life than she had in years. By July, she realized this might be more than friendship. They were having dinner at Catherine's apartment. Nothing fancy, just pasta and wine and easy conversation when Catherine mentioned her late husband. He died 5 years ago after a long illness. She spent the last few years figuring out how to live alone after decades of partnership. I didn't think I'd want to share my life with anyone again, Catherine said, refilling their wine glasses. I thought I was done with all that, but lately I've been reconsidering. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Reconsidering how? Catherine met her eyes directly. Reconsidering whether being alone is actually what I want, or just what felt the safest after a loss. By September, they were officially together. Eleanor had expected it to feel strange starting a romantic relationship at 63 with a woman after decades of assuming that part of her life was finished. But instead, it felt surprisingly natural. Easy in ways her earlier relationships never had been. Catherine understood her work, shared her interests, and wanted the same kind of life Eleanor wanted. They moved in together the following spring. Eleanor was 64, Catherine was 67, and they were both old enough to know not to waste time on unnecessary caution. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Morning coffee together while reading separate books. Evening walks discussing whatever they'd learned or thought about during the day. Shared cooking, shared space, shared life in ways that felt sustainable. Eleanor had what she'd wanted, genuine partnership and real love. The years that she lost didn't feel like enough to outweigh what she'd gained. They had 7 years together, 7 years of the kind of companionship Eleanor had spent most of her life convinced she'd never have. They traveled together, they hosted dinners with friends, they read books together, and argued about silly things. They navigated the ordinary frustrations of cohabitation and discovered they were both remarkably good at compromise when it mattered. Eleanor never told Catherine about the coffee shop. It felt too strange, too impossible to explain, and besides, what they had was real. The trade had provided opportunity, but the love itself was entirely genuine. On a Tuesday morning in October, Eleanor woke up feeling slightly off. Nothing dramatic, just a vague sense that something wasn't quite right. She mentioned it to Catherine, who suggested calling their doctor just to be safe. The doctor ordered tests. The tests revealed advanced cancer, aggressive, and already metastasized beyond surgical intervention. How long? Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Months, the doctor said gently. Perhaps 6 if we pursue aggressive treatment. Perhaps 3 without it. Eleanor sat in the examination room after the doctor left, trying to process this information. She was 71. She'd had a good life. She'd accomplished things she was proud of. She had love, finally, which was more than she'd expected to find at this stage. But she thought she had more time. Another decade maybe, enough to grow old with Catherine, to have the kind of long partnership that deepened over years. Instead, she had months. She thought about the coffee shop, about the pale cup, about trading lifespan for opportunity. She'd chosen the lowest cost option. 3 years, the figure had said. When they got home, they cried together. They made the decision to pursue aggressive treatment together, They rearranged their lives around doctor's appointments and symptom management and trying to maintain normalcy in whatever time remained. Catherine never asked if Eleanor regretted their relationship. Maybe she saw something in Eleanor's face that made the question unnecessary. Maybe she knew that love was worth the cost, regardless of duration. Eleanor didn't regret it. She had 7 years of genuine partnership. For companionship and love, and shared life in ways she'd never expected to have. Was it worth it? On good days, absolutely. On days when the pain made everything difficult and she was too exhausted to do more than exist, she still thought yes. On days when she watched Catherine's face and saw the anticipatory grief already settling there, she thought yes, even though it hurt them both. Eleanor died on a Sunday morning in March, 6 months after the diagnosis. Catherine was there, so were a few close friends. Eleanor had chosen to spend her final weeks at home, rather than in a hospital, surrounded by familiar things and people who loved her. Her last clear thought was a simple one. She was grateful. Grateful for the coffee shop that had appeared in the fog. Grateful for the opportunity that had led to Catherine. Grateful for 7 years of the kind of love she'd spent most of her life believing she didn't deserve. She'd chosen well.
Chapter 6. The Still God Settles. The patron opened its eyes and understood, and saw the world with purpose. It had successfully gathered the 4 elements to fully interact with the physical realm. It stood in the coffee shop and looked at its hands with wonder that felt both foreign and entirely natural. It had hands, actual hands, that it could flex and control, with lines across the palms and small imperfections that made them feel natural. It touched the counter and felt the worn wood grain beneath its fingers, cool and solid and real. This was what Eleanor had given to it, the final component that made the manifestation complete. Lifespan anchored everything else. Sight that could perceive, heart that could feel, voice that could express, all wrapped in the finite container of a body that existed in space and time. It looked down at itself and saw a form that had settled into something consistent. Middle-aged adult with feminine features thanks to Eleanor. Skin, a warm brown that matched Eleanor's complexion. Hair, dark and slightly wavy. A body that felt complete. The glass greenhouse beyond the back room had filled completely over the months since Eleanor's trade. Sight glowed in luminous threads, pulsing with captured light and color. Hearts bloomed like a flower constructed of warmth and longing, petals that seemed to breathe with emotion. Voice resonated as visible waves of sound, frozen mid-expression. And now, lifespan, Eleanor's 3 remaining years, settled like sediment in water, layers of compressed time that would sustain her until they ran out. The patron, though that designation felt inadequate now that it was fully manifested, walked to the front window and looked out at the fog beginning to lift. It has been in this current location for 3 days, ever since Eleanor had made her trade. The shop had remained here, waiting for the final component to arrive, waiting for her to complete what she'd started. Now it could settle. No, now she could settle. She felt the shop respond to her intention, roots that weren't physical but were no less real, sinking into this particular location. The wandering would stop. For 3 years, this corner would be her corner. This building would be her building. This town would be her town. She didn't know the name of the place yet, didn't know anything about it, except that she could leave her shop and interact with humanity like she could not do before. The patron locked the front door and turned the sign to closed even though the shop had never operated on a traditional schedule before. She walked through the shop, touching everything. The tables and chairs she'd observed countless people sit in. The bookshelves she'd watched guests browse while making decisions about impossible trades. The counter where she'd prepared the drinks. Marcus had given his sight to be seen as herself. Teresa had given her heart to care for her children without the weight of feeling. Daniel had given his voice to belong without agency. Eleanor had given part of her lifespan to have the opportunity for love. Each trade had cost them something irreplaceable. Each trade had given her something essential. She stood in the greenhouse and felt gratitude, actual gratitude, made possible by the heart she'd borrowed from Teresa. The emotion was almost overwhelming in its intensity. "Thank you," she said aloud, testing the voice that Daniel had traded. Her words resonated in the small space, rich and clear and entirely her own. The components pulsed in response, as if acknowledging her thanks. The patron she would meet to choose a name now. The patron decided on a name by evening, Asher. It meant fortunate or blessed in one of the languages humans used, which felt appropriate given what she'd been given. She began living as a human, experiencing the full range of what that meant. Joy and frustration, connection and loneliness, satisfaction and uncertainty. All of it magnified by the awareness that her time was limited, that eventually she'd dissolve back into formlessness, and these 3 years would be documented in her journals, but not remembered with the visceral intensity of actual lived experience. That impermanence made everything more precious. She understood why humans treasured moments, not despite their brevity, but because of it. She wrote journal entries documenting her 3 years of manifestation, what she learned, how it had felt to be human. She wondered sometimes if her journals would affect her future selves, if reading about guilt and responsibility would change how they conducted trades. But she suspected not. Her base state was what it was: clinical, observational, incapable of the emotional nuance, void of moral considerations. The town, Asher, had thrived for those 3 years. The prosperity she'd brought infused into the community structure, enriching the lives of everyone living nearby.
Quote of the week. Every act of choice is an act of creation and of destruction. Simone de Beauvoir. Thank you for listening to The Hole in the Wall, a heartwarming story. Hope you enjoyed the story. If you want to hear more, please like, subscribe, and comment.